Hello, I'm doing a review for this book. It is the Gulag Archipelago Volume 2 by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. I did a review for Volume 1, I think it was last year. I was really impressed with that, so I've decided to read the other two volumes as well. So I'll be honest, I didn't find this book as shocking as the first one. I think I was quite naive about a lot of things to do with you know, the USSR. So it was a real eye-opener for me, the first book. So this one, it didn't have quite that shock factor, but obviously a lot of the details are still really disturbing. Yeah, in some ways it is quite a hard read, but it's very, very well written, so you know, it's readable. So although it's not as shocking, it's still some, you know, awful questions that I think you have to ask yourself when you're reading these kinds of books about human nature and what humans are capable, what drives people to, you know, behave in these ways, good and evil. And it's been having me question whether civilizations can ever really work. There always seems to be, you know, a big pile of losers. Obviously, some are far more brutal than others. But yeah, it's really had me questioning that. So the first volume talked more about sort of the arrest process and being charged in transit prisons and things. Whereas this book, it's more about in the actual camps. So once people have been sentenced to however many years it is of hard labour, talks about the spread of the camps and different places they were and how many people were involved. There is a lot of dispute about the figures. I mean, this Solzhenitsyn's book is sort of put together from people's recollections, because at this time particularly there was no official data as to where the camps were and the numbers of people involved and things like that. So it's all put together from people's actual recollections. Talks about living and working conditions, which were brutal, to say the least. Really, really awful. Talks about the communities that built up around the camps through trading with the camps and supplying things, and, you know, that whole thing. Talks about punishments that were given to people, the prison hierarchy. So you've got things like the Chekists, the trustees, the guards, and the workers. Talks about how the workers were organised into brigades, and how food was used to try and encourage people to work harder, or to punish people for not working as hard as they wanted them to. Talks a lot about the inefficiency of the system. It's basically a slavery system and a punishment system, and the people are sort of slowly starving to death as they're working. And talks about the inefficiencies in what they're actually trying to achieve in getting the work done, but also that work probably would never have been able to have been achieved through sort of better working conditioned paid work and things like that, because of the sheer scale of it. Yeah, it's very interesting. Talks about the health problems that people went through from malnutrition and the absolutely awful conditions. Talks about the corruption of the people living there, and, you know, the sort of the culture of the camps, and, you know, it's really dark. Yeah, it's very dark. Also talks about the pressures on Russian society not to trust each other and to turn on each other, and instead of standing up for their, you know, fellow people, their friends and family, to actually turn their back on them in a sort of self-interested, you know, desire to just survive and not end up in that place as well. And it was pretty brutal. Right, I'll read a couple of quotes. What have we got? Page 71. So he is talking about this drive for this. It's not just industrialisation of the country, it is super, super, super industrialisation of the country, and the 5-year plans that set out these really ambitious projects. And then he says, well, the archipelago did not develop on its own, but side by side with the whole country. Okay, so it's those desires of the country and acceptance of that that allowed it to happen. And it developed all throughout the country, and the country had, interactions with the camp and the work that was going on, and, the whole sort of culture built up around it. Okay. There's a few examples in there about the work, such as the canals that were built, and the inefficiencies and the inadequacies of, the whole planning and carrying out of the work. And it's almost laughable if, people weren't living in such awful conditions and dying in the whole process to achieve something that's really so low quality and even unusable in certain situations. I mean, how insane is that all this effort would go into something, but because it was done in such a rush and so pressured and so badly, you actually end up with something you can't even use at the end of it. Yeah, it would be, obviously funny if it wasn't so absolutely tragic. So he talks as well a lot in the book, a lot about the thieves, which is sort of a section of society, the thieves. So most of the prisoners are political prisoners who have been put there for not, the reasons are, completely ridiculous. You can be imprisoned for so little, speaking out against the regime and things, not going along with it, or not being seen to perform well enough to it. But then you had other people in the prison who were the thieves, who were like criminals, proper criminals. And they were really elevated in the camps because they weren't the political prisoners who were so looked down upon. The thieves were given, a lot of better positions as sort of guards and trustees and things, who had more position in the camp. But the thieves were, Solzhenitsyn speaks very, very badly of them, that these people were really, very immoral and, really horrible, nasty, dark characters. Right, so in this quote, he's talking about them. Even more consistently than before, the thieves were given all the commanding heights in camp. Even more consistently than before, the thieves were egged on against the 58s, permitted to plunder them without any obstacles, to beat, to choke. The thieves became just like an internal camp police, camp stormtroopers. And it's really important to recognise how that, affected things in the camp, that the actual people who, were organising the camps and were in charge of them didn't necessarily do the actual groundwork, and that was left to people who were maybe more brutal. Who were certainly very, very brutal. Yeah. Yes, it's it's all awful. Right. 197. So this quote is Solzhenitsyn talking about one time when they've come back from work. He's on general work, which is sort of the hard labour at a clay pit, and there's been a power cut, and he's talking about that and talks about them coming back. And then he finishes by saying, and tomorrow would be the same, and every day. 6 cars of red clay, 3 scoops of black gruel. In prison too we seemed to have grown weak, but here it went much faster. There was already a ringing in the head. That pleasant weakness in which it is easier to give in than to fight back kept coming closer. And in the barracks, total darkness. We lay there dressed in everything wet, on everything bare, and it seemed it was warmer not to take anything off, like a poultice. Open eyes looked at the black ceiling, at the black heavens. Good Lord, good Lord, beneath the shells and the bombs I begged you to preserve my life. And now I beg you, please send me death. Okay, that's like obviously a really strong quote. And the whole book is written in a really strong way. And for something that's so sort of dark and depressing and demoralising, there's actually, quite a lot of energy through a lot of it. And that sort of can keep you reading. Right, so in the next quote, he's talking about the trustees. So these are people who would have a slightly better position in camp. So there's a big thing that, you know, if you're on the general work, this is the hard work that's going to kill you, because you're going to be using far more energy, far more, you know, effort than you can replenish through rest and food. So you want to, if you possibly can, to get out of doing general work and be a trustee, which will be a slightly better position, and that might be like a professional position or something like that. So these are just some examples of some of the trustee positions. So you've got like laundress, hospital attendants, dishwasher, stoker, bath workers, cooks, helps, bakers, barracks orderlies. We're all trustees. They're sort of a lower class of trustees. And then you have the sort of higher class of them, cooks, bread cutters, store clerks, doctors, medical assistants, barbers, you know, all sorts of things. There's a whole real, like a, you know, it's a whole working community. And if you could get into one of those positions, you wouldn't be doing such difficult work, and you might get more food. And obviously, if you're working with food, you can siphon off some of it. And there was a lot of that, of siphoning off food. So then the actual workers get even less. And the same things was happening when sort of if somebody was in charge of food coming into an area, again they'd take some, such as hospitals and things, which obviously sounds really brutal. It really does sound like a place just devoid of ethics. There's blackmail, threats, violence, murder. You know, it's really, really dark. The thieves' law, cruelty. I mean, when he's talking about it, you know, it sounds like hell. It really does. It's really awful. But, you know, I'm sure we'll all be warmed to know that class suppression was not a casualty. And he talks about, you know, sort of the easier ride that people got when they were from higher classes in society. Now, obviously, in this regime, they have apparently got rid of class, and it's all about raising the workers. But you do still have a class system. It's just not aristocratic. It's more, you know, people involved with the party and the governing forces and things. Yeah. Yep, some things never change. He also talks about how there was sort of a cultural hole in the arts caused by how many people ended up in prison camps and who were not contributing to the normal artistic, you know, milieu of a society. So there was a lack of stories, art, music, and things like that. Because everything was so controlled in the society, everybody had to follow, you know, the narrative and the rules and not say anything questionable, that you really lost that artistic creation. And also the people who were actually in the camps, who were artistic, couldn't help but produce things, whether it was poetry or music or you know, some kind of other art with their hands. They just couldn't help themselves, but it would then be destroyed because it couldn't be allowed to get out. It's, you know, it's really tragic. Okay, right, a couple more quotes. So in this quote, Solzhenitsyn's talking about how he got involved in a drama group. Now, you wouldn't think something like that was going on, but it was. There were drama groups, and you know, the plays would be sort of supportive of the regime, but they would go round from camp to camp to entertain people at certain times. And he was involved in one, and he wanted to join the travelling troupe. Despite all my efforts, I did not succeed in becoming a member of that troupe. Soon afterwards, they left the Kaluga gates, and I lost sight of them. A year later, I heard a rumour at the Butiki, that's probably pronounced wrong, sorry for my awful pronunciations, that they had been travelling on a truck to one of their regular performances and had been hit by a train. I do not know whether Glazunov was there or not, but so far as I myself was concerned, I once more realised that the ways of the Lord are imponderable, that we ourselves never know what we want. And how many times in life I passionately sought what I did not need and been despondent over failures which were successes. And I know that's not necessarily about the conditions in camp, but, you know, that's a really deep quote, especially for me, who's interested in sort of understanding life and things like that. Really made me think about how true that is. Yeah, how we don't really know what we want, and you know, things happen and you think, what was that, lucky, was that unlucky? And yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, so here he's talking about Campside, which is the sort of community that's growing up around the camp. So they're not people that are necessarily in the camp, but they're people who will come in and do some work and will trade with the camp, things like that. Like a piece of rotten meat, which not only stinks right on its own surface, but also surrounds itself with a stinking molecular cloud of stink. So too, each island of the archipelago created and supported a zone of stink around itself. Okay, and then I'm going to miss out a bit and continue. The thieves' philosophy, which initially had conquered the archipelago, easily swept further and captured the all-union ideological market, a wasteland without any stronger ideology. Okay, so he really talks about that, how that thieves' philosophy really permeates into the whole society, because the you know, overarching thing is just so weak and so empty, and everybody, you know, that everybody's going along with it, but it's not something anybody can really, well, people did get passionate about it, but not most people. So it allowed this other culture to really seep out and have a stronghold. Okay. Here in this quote, he's talking about what they actually achieved through the camps. Obviously, they got a lot of work done that they wouldn't have been able to get done otherwise. But the quality of it was really low, and the whole effectiveness of people working, you know, they'd really do anything they could not to work, because it was such hard work and they were getting so little food and their conditions were so bad. So anything people could do not to work, they would absolutely take that. And he talked about how you know, they tried to encourage people to work harder, to exceed their norms, which was set, which was sort of how much they were supposed to produce or work, that if they exceeded those norms, they would be given extra food. But the amount of work that you needed to do to get such a meagre amount of extra food was just not worth it. And there were even cases of people injuring themselves and things to get out of work. So he's talking about how ineffective the whole system actually was. But no matter how they huffed and puffed and broke all their nails on the crags, no matter how they corrected the plan fulfillment sheets 20 times over and wore them down to holes in the paper, the archipelago did not pay its own way, and it never will. Okay, and I'll just miss out a little section. And here's why. The first and principal cause was the lack of conscientiousness of the prisoners, the negligence of those stupid slaves. Not only couldn't you expect any socialist self-sacrifice of them, but they didn't even manifest simple capitalistic diligence. All they were on the lookout for was ways to spoil their footgear and not go out to work. How to wreck a crane, to buckle a wheel, to break a spade, to sink a pail, anything for a pretext to sit down and smoke. All that the camp inmates made for their own dear state was openly and blatantly botched. You could break the bricks they made with your bare hands. The paint would peel off the panels. The plaster would fall off. Posts would fall down. Tables rock. Legs fell out. Handles came off. Carelessness and mistakes were everywhere. And that's really an important thing to remember about the ineffectiveness of this form of work. You know, it can sound like a sort of easy solution for tyrannical leaders to have everybody working and in a form of poverty and desperation, but actually what you get out of it is really low grade and low quality, because why would anybody take any pride in their work? Yeah, that also reminded me about him talking about earlier in the book about the real primitiveness of the tools that they used, the works that they were doing, and the shortness of supplies and the low grade of the supplies that they were using to actually try and achieve these things that were being pushed. It's just an absolutely insane situation. Okay. Also in the book, Solzhenitsyn talks about a sort of spiritual development. Obviously, this whole communist regime was very ungodly, and I mean, I spoke in the other review about you know, the arrests and imprisonment of religious people, or people who followed religion or put religion before the state. I mean, it's really, really shocking. And the fact that religious buildings were even used to imprison people, I mean, it's just like so awful. But he also talks about how actually a lot of people in the camp had a sort of spiritual awakening, even if they weren't that way inclined before. And so he also talks about how you have all this time to think about yourself, your life, your choices, and how you've got to where you are. Here is how it was with many others, not just with me. Our initial first prison sky consisted of black swirling storm clouds and black pillars of volcanic eruptions. This was the heaven of Pompeii, the heaven of the day of judgment, because it was not just anyone who had been arrested, but I, the centre of this world. And that's so important to remember. You know, we do take ourselves very, very seriously. And when things happen to us, there is often that overriding thought of, it's not just the tragedy of what's happened, but it's happening to me. You know, it's not that these things happen in the world, but that actually is happening to me. And that's something also to think about when you think about people who have gone through these things and who are going through things now in the world today, but also in the past as well. To think that they were people, you know, as whole and sovereign really as we are, and just what it means to do that to somebody. I think you also need to think of that in terms of the people who were inflicting these things as well. It's, you know, there's a lot to think about there. Okay, I think I've got one more quote, and this is about self-censorship. So he talks as well about how the whole archipelago system would not have been able to evolve and develop and maintain the way it did. I mean, the way it was continued for so many years is really shocking. And that's something, you know, I think when we're taught at school about the Nazis and the brutality of that regime, and there's this sort of belief that, well, you know, it wore itself out quite quickly. That sort of thing could never continue. But this system in Russia and other ones in other countries and other times, they can persist and continue if they're not, you know, actively stopped. And he talks about how the whole country and the whole you know, feeling of the whole population allowed that to continue. This fear that everybody was always living in, that you couldn't say things or you couldn't do things because of this fear of being arrested, but actually how that lack of standing up against this allowed it to continue for so long. So I just wanted to do one last quote about that and to also compare that to today. So this is the quote. And what can be said about those shrill meetings and trashy lunch break gatherings where you are compelled to vote against your own opinion, to pretend to be glad over what distresses you, be it a new state loan, the lowering of peace rates, contributions to some tank column, Sunday work duties, or sending your children to help on the collective farm, and to express the deepest anger in areas about which you couldn't care less, some kind of intangible, invisible violence in the West Indies or Paraguay. Okay, so I think it's really, obviously, I don't think that the way that things are at the moment is the same as how things were in Soviet Russia, but there are some really worrying signs about people fearful to say things or just speak their opinion just because they'll get a load of crap for it. Obviously, it's not quite so extreme, but actually the cowardice of people is really shining, and should be worth considered, especially as to where it could potentially lead. So that's that book. I've finished that. I definitely want to read volume 3, so I'll have a look out for that. The book I'm reading at the moment is Kabbalistic Tarot, and that's on the Kindle, which is a new experience for me to read anything on there. That's going very well. Yes, and I'll give a review for that when I finished it. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you.